The Lincoln Project is set to spend millions of dollars in swing states through the election day, aiming to turn Republican voters against President Trump. The Never Trump Republicans who started the Lincoln Project have a singular mission. That's to defeat Trump in the polls in November. But is that their only motive? We're going to dig into it.
So according to the Washington Post, the Lincoln Project wants the GOP to have their own internal reckoning by working to increase voter turnout. Joining us now to discuss is author of the best-selling book, Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance. Great to see you, J.D. Welcome back.
Good to see you, J.D.
So this interview with John Weaver, who's one of the people behind the Lincoln Project, was really interesting because part of the critique of the Lincoln Project is basically these guys were on board for all of it right up to Donald Trump. And now that they're not part of the inner circle, that's really where their beef is. And so when he was pressed on things like, OK, so if Joe Biden wants to raise taxes on the wealthy, something that you and your compatriots have opposed for the entirety of your professional careers, are you going to back him? Are you not going to back him? He didn't really have a response. So what do you make of all of this, JD?
I think there are a couple of things going on. First, I tend to see the Never Trump movement primarily as ideological, right? There are some people who just really dislike the president personally. But if you look at the main folks who are involved in the Lincoln Project, what they really want is to maintain the standard neoconservative commitment to free trade, neoliberal economics, and especially really aggressive foreign wars. And if you think of the people involved, whether it's John Weaver or Bill Kristol, they're all sort of on that same ideological wavelength. I think the second thing that's happening is that these folks, frankly, realize that they're off of the Republican dollar. They realize that because of the way they've constructed their role in politics over the past 4, 5, 10 years, they really don't have a paycheck coming from the standard Republican Party. And so I think they're trying to find another way to ensure that they can actually cut a paycheck in politics. And that's, unfortunately, that's how a lot of political operatives work. But I think it's why, if you actually talk to these folks, it's not really clear what they really want to accomplish.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, JD.
It's been very successful, too, by the way.
It's been very successful. They're making quite a bit of money from it. In a way, though, is it a good thing that John Kasich is just somebody who's going to come out there and say, I'm speaking at the Democratic convention, I'm endorsing Joe Biden? As somebody like yourself, you want to redefine conservatism, move the Republican Party in a more working class direction. Is it, frankly, just a good thing to say goodbye to these people and let them reveal themselves for what they're really all about?
Yeah, I think that's right. If you look at the people that the Republican Party is effectively discarding through this entire realignment process that we've seen under Trump, it's primarily people that we probably don't want to have in the party anyway. If you think of John Kasich, my former governor here in Ohio, his real ideological commitments, such that they exist, were to free trade and to deficit reduction. I think two issues that obviously are just not animating the Republican Party these days. If you think of folks like John Weaver, like Bill Kristol, their commitments are fundamentally at odds with the increasingly working class hue of the Republican Party. And so it just doesn't make a ton of sense for the sorts of people, downscale, non-college educated folks who are really looking to have some response from politics to the problems of globalization, to even be in the same party as people like Weaver, Kasich, Bill Kristol, and so forth. So I don't think it's surprising that you're seeing the divorce, and ultimately it's a good thing because, hopefully as those people move out of the party, we have some other folks moving into the party who are pushing it in a better direction.
Well, and therein lies the problem, JD, because you don't have those people moving into the party right now. I mean, we've been covering here on this show, yes, a big part of the Democratic surge, both in 2018 and also in 2020, is this flight of white, affluent suburbanites into the Democratic Party, the type of people who might, be won over by the Lincoln Project or by John Kasich. But at the same time, there's actually a pretty significant shift of non-college educated white voters and rural voters away from President Trump as well. I covered here a poll that showed disapproval of his coronavirus rate very high among rural voters and among Southerners as well. And that disapproval has been ticking up at a faster pace even than among those affluent white suburbanites. So what does that mean for the Republican Party? And what do you think the lessons are going to be after November if Donald Trump does, in fact, lose in a significant way as he's on track to do right now?
Well, I think there's a short-term answer and a long-term answer to that question, Crystal. The short-term answer is that if you look at where President Trump has been weakest, especially with his core group of voters, it's tended to be where he's embraced establishment Republican priorities. Frankly, priorities that aren't all that different from what Bill Kristol would have pushed 5 or 10 years ago in the Republican Party. You know, arguably his weakest moment politically has not been the reaction to the coronavirus, but it was when the Obamacare repeal and replace and tax reform sort of happened simultaneously. And people just realized that a lot of middle class, working class voters just didn't care about those legislative priorities, and consequently Republicans suffered. The longer term answer, though, is I think that for any type of real realignment to happen, Republicans have to recognize they need two core groups of voters. They need those working class white voters that you just mentioned, but they also need working and middle class voters from minority communities to come over to the Republican Party. There's some evidence that's happening with Hispanic voters. There's a little bit of evidence that's happening with black voters. But the way I tend to frame this is actually very similar to the way that I think the British Conservative Party has thought about these things for the past 15 or 20 years, where every time they lost one voter in the London suburbs and the London exurbs, they gained 1.5 or 2 voters in some of the classically labor areas of the country. Republicans have to make that trade. And frankly, if they only make one side of that trade where they lose voters but don't gain any, then they're going to be in a real tough spot for the next few years.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, obviously, JD. But we haven't seen much of the effort from that in the midst of these coronavirus bailouts and many of the economic priorities that we see right now from the White House on down to the GOP caucus, absent a few senators who are willing to think for themselves, seems to be very much caught up in Steve Moore, Art Laffer, trickle-down ideology. What is the core problem, in your view, that stops the Republican Party at this moment from pursuing the agenda that you and I care about so much?
Yeah, I think, first of all, if the party goes down that pathway, meaning especially austere in the face of this coronavirus pandemic and the economic fallout, I think they're going to be hammered at the ballot box in November. I just don't think there's any pathway for them that runs through the Steve Moore, Art Laffer style of economics. But to answer your question, I think that for them to make major inroads, they have to recognize what the real problem is. And the problem right now is institutional conservatism. There are a lot of institutions, a lot of think tanks, a lot of organizations that earn a lot of money by pushing economic policies that are in the interests of big Republican donors. And this tension has been there in the Republican Party for 2 decades now. It's very obvious. The interests of the donors are just not aligned with the interests of the working and middle class grassroots voters. And eventually one of those two interests has to win out. My hope is that if the working class interests win out, then you start to attract other working class voters from the Democratic Party, and then you have a viable coalition. But that's a big if, and I think it requires Republicans to recognize that what's in the interest of the donors right now just isn't in the interest of them politically or in the interest of the broader country.
And JD, finally, you're on the ground in Ohio. You live in Cincinnati. Great sense of the political environment there. I mean, Ohio's a state that really Democrats had kind of written off to a large extent. It was one that has been steadily moving to the right, certainly in what looked like a realignment. What do you make of the dynamics there? What issues do you think are top of mind for voters in Ohio right now?
Certainly, I think the economy, the coronavirus pandemic, and the fallout economically, I think a lot of people feel very insecure, very worried about the next few months for very obvious reasons. And if you talk to Democrats, my sense is that they feel pretty optimistic about Ohio in 2020. I believe Trump won Ohio by 9 points in 2016. Senator Rob Portman, very popular here, won Ohio by, I think, 20 points. And if Democrats are competitive, if they win Ohio, they will certainly win the election and win the election big in November. And so I think the fact that Democrats feel optimistic, maybe not confident, but certainly optimistic about Ohio is not a good side for my side of the aisle.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Thank you, JD. Appreciate your analysis.
Great to see you, JD. Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.
Next on Rising, Hillary Clinton talks about Russia's influence over the minds and votes of Americans. Still in 2020 when Rising returns.